Sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories. All it takes is for someone to listen. The room was quiet, eerily so, like the stillness before a storm. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, bouncing off cold marble walls and polished floors. It was just another chilly morning in Branch County Courthouse, a place where time moved slow and faces moved faster. The kind of place where justice was routine, and names on paper rarely came with stories worth remembering. Until that morning. Two uniformed deputies led an older man into the courtroom, the jingle of handcuffs echoing louder than it should have. He walked with the stiffness of someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long, not just in his bones, but in his soul. His coat hung from his shoulders like a heavy curtain, faded olive green and 2 sizes too big, with the lining frayed and stitched clumsily in spots where time had tried to tear it apart. The coat was military issue, vintage, like the man wearing it. The bailiff cleared his throat. Case number 52A. City of Millstone vs. Carter, Daniel Thomas. The man lifted his head slightly. His eyes, a stormy gray, met the judge's for only a moment before drifting back to the floor. His voice, barely more than a whisper, rasped through the silence. Daniel Carter. Gunnery Sergeant. United States Marine Corps. The courtroom didn't move. Not at first. Judge Emma Caldwell peered over her reading glasses, reaching for the case file with mild disinterest. She was a precise woman, in her early 60s now, with silver streaks woven into her dark hair like threads of quiet wisdom. 22 years on the bench had taught her how to detach, to treat each case like paperwork, not people. She flipped the folder open, skimming the arrest notes, prior citations, and then she stopped. Her fingers froze mid-page. Her eyes, so practiced at holding steady, suddenly faltered. The blood drained from her face in a slow, ghostly wave. The name. It was him. The man who had once pulled her brother from the fiery maw of war. The man she tried to find after her brother's funeral. The man whose name she had whispered in prayers during sleepless nights. He was standing right there in her courtroom. In handcuffs. For trespassing. She drew in a shaky breath, composing herself as best she could, her voice steady but softer now. "Mr. Carter," she said, "please have a seat." Daniel sat on the bench, his body folding into itself like a worn-out canvas tent collapsing under its own weight. At 71, he looked like someone who had lived 5 lifetimes in the span of one. Once, long ago, he had stood tall with polished boots, creased blues, and a chest full of medals. Today, he wore second-hand clothes from a shelter donation bin and boots with cracked soles. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from years of arthritis and untreated injuries. Scars peeked from beneath his cuffs, some old, others more recent. He had served in both Desert Storm and Iraq, wounded not once but multiple times. But none of those wounds had cut as deep as the ones no one could see. The young prosecutor, a fresh-faced man in his early 30s with a haircut too perfect and a suit that screamed privilege, stood and began reading off the charges like they were items on a grocery list. "Your Honor, the defendant has been cited multiple times for loitering behind the Dandelion Cafe on East Jefferson. The business owner has filed 3 complaints this month alone. We're requesting 40 hours of community service and a no trespass order for the downtown district." No one mentioned why Daniel Carter had chosen that particular alley. No one said it was the only place in town where warm air from the kitchen vents spilled into the winter night. Or that the cook, Tyler, often left half a sandwich wrapped in napkins near the dumpster when he closed up. Daniel didn't beg. He never did. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply cleared his throat, his voice like dry gravel. "Wasn't looking for trouble, Your Honor. Just trying to stay warm." Emma leaned forward. "Why that location, Mr. Carter?" He hesitated. Then said, "Tyler, he's the cook, he leaves food sometimes. His dad served with me in the Gulf." The court file mentioned none of this. Just a list of offenses and a recommendation for exile from the only places keeping Daniel alive. Then, unexpectedly, the courtroom doors creaked open. Everyone turned as a tall, sharp-suited man strode in with confident urgency. He carried a worn leather briefcase and an air of authority that immediately turned heads. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "Benjamin Hall, representing Mr. Carter. Apologies for the interruption." Daniel turned to look at the stranger with confusion written across his face. "I didn't call no lawyer," he whispered. "Can't afford one either." Benjamin leaned down and replied softly, "You don't need to. My firm is taking your case pro bono. Someone's watching out for you, Gunnery Sergeant." Emma looked from Hall to Daniel and back again. The courtroom had shifted. A current of something unspoken ran through the air, recognition, fate, something heavier than coincidence. "This is highly irregular," she said, though her voice had lost its edge. Hall nodded respectfully. "Understood, Your Honor. We're requesting a brief recess to speak with our client." Emma closed the file slowly. 15 minutes. As the judge exited the courtroom, Daniel turned to the man beside him. "Why?" he asked. Benjamin looked him in the eye. "Because sometimes, Sergeant, good men slip through the cracks. And it's time somebody pulled you out." In the silence that followed, Daniel Carter sat back in his seat, still shackled, still weathered by life, but now, for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't invisible.
We'd love to know where you're watching from. It means so much to have you here. If you're new, please give us a like and subscribe to be part of this warm and growing community.
The courtroom had emptied temporarily, but the air still buzzed with something unspoken. Daniel Carter sat alone on the bench, his hands cuffed, his thoughts louder than the silence around him. He couldn't quite process what had just happened. Who was this lawyer who'd appeared out of nowhere, and why did he seem to care so deeply about an old man with no money and nowhere to go? Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his fingers knotted tightly together. The ache in his knuckles pulsed with every breath, a dull reminder of bones fractured decades ago in lands that no longer remembered him. His thoughts drifted to the cafe vent, the only warm place he knew, and to the quiet kindness of Tyler, the young man who never once judged him for lingering too long near the back door. Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers just beyond the wall, Emma Caldwell stood frozen in front of her desk. Her robe hung heavily on her shoulders, but it was her heart that weighed most. She had locked the door behind her. For a long moment, she just stared at the name typed across the file folder, Daniel Thomas Carter. She whispered it again, softly, reverently. Then she opened the drawer of her desk, the one she almost never touched, and pulled out a small, worn photo. In it, a much younger Emma stood beside a proud young Marine, Lieutenant Ryan Caldwell, in full dress blues. His smile was wide, his hand slung around her shoulder with the careless affection of a loving brother. He had written to her every week during his deployment, letters full of sand, hope, sarcasm, and fear hidden between lines. And then there was the last one. The one that mentioned Staff Sergeant Carter. "He saved me today, M. Ran through hell itself to drag me out. Took 2 bullets and didn't stop. Said, you're not dying on my watch. I owe him more than I can say." 2 weeks after that letter, Ryan was killed by an IED while leading a patrol outside Ramadi. At his funeral, one of the Marines had approached Emma's parents and quietly told them, "Your son saved my life, but Sergeant Carter saved all of us." Emma had tried to find Daniel after that. But the military bureaucracy had been a fortress. He'd been redeployed, then discharged after sustaining a traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD. After that, he vanished into the system, a file buried in paperwork, a name that collected dust. Until now. A gentle knock interrupted her memories. "Emma," came a familiar voice. It was Benjamin Hall, her late husband's former law partner, and one of the few people allowed to call her by her first name in this building. He stepped into the room and closed the door gently behind him. "What's going on?" he asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. She handed him the photo and then pointed to the file. That's him, Ben. The one from Ryan's letters. He's the man who carried my brother through gunfire 20 years ago. Benjamin stared at the photo, his face slowly registering the connection. You're sure? Positive. His service record matches exactly. Same unit. Same date. Same battle. Ben exhaled slowly and looked back at her. Does he know who you are? Emma shook her head. No. I wasn't Judge Caldwell back then. I just passed the bar. Married Thomas a year later and took his name. There's no way he'd recognize me now. They stood in silence a moment longer, until Ben finally asked the question hanging heavy in the air. What are you going to do? Emma turned to the window. Outside, the wind was whipping through bare trees, rattling the courthouse windows like a warning. I'm not letting him slip away again, she said. Ben stepped forward. You know there are ethics concerns. This is your courtroom. There are also ethics in how we treat the people who gave up everything for this country, she replied, voice firm. And how we answer when fate gives us a second chance. Back in the courtroom, Daniel remained seated while a deputy brought him a small cup of water. He sipped it slowly, his hands still shaking from the cold and perhaps from something deeper. Across the room, Benjamin Hall returned, sat beside him, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Gunnery Sergeant, I need to ask you a few questions. Is that all right? Daniel shrugged. Long as I'm not being charged with breathing too loud. Ben smiled. That's a start. Now, when were you last able to access your VA benefits? Daniel's brow furrowed. Been years. Got lost in the paperwork, I think. Moved around too much. They sent letters to places I didn't live anymore. I stopped trying after a while. And your injuries, do you have any documented medical files for them? Some. VA had them back when I was in Philly, I think. Or maybe it was Denver. Honestly, I've lost track. Some days I wake up and can't feel my right foot for an hour. Other days I forget what day it is. Ben was scribbling notes. We're going to fix this. You understand me? My firm handles military advocacy cases. You're not just some stranger, we take this personally. Daniel chuckled bitterly. Everyone says that until they see my file. Ben paused. You know. Judge Caldwell knew your name the moment you said it. I think you made more of an impact than you realize. Daniel looked up, confused. She did. Ben nodded. You saved someone she loved. When Judge Caldwell returned to the courtroom 10 minutes later, there was a new stillness in the room, not cold, like before, but charged, almost sacred. Behind her walked a man in full military uniform, Colonel Robert Jenkins, retired Marine Corps, and two younger service members, one carrying a polished wooden box. Daniel instinctively stood, posture straightening almost unconsciously. It wasn't just habit, it was memory, deeply carved into his bones. Emma took her seat, removed her glasses, and for the first time since she'd taken the bench, she spoke not as a judge, but as a sister. Before we proceed, I have a personal disclosure to make regarding this case. The judge's voice was composed, but anyone listening closely could hear the weight pressing down behind it, like the tightrope walk between duty and emotion. She took a steadying breath and glanced across the courtroom, eyes pausing briefly on Daniel Carter. For the record, she began, Lieutenant Ryan Caldwell, the Marine mentioned by the defendant, was my younger brother. A soft gasp spread across the gallery. Even the court reporter dropped her pen for half a second. Emma continued, her voice unwavering now, though her hands trembled slightly as she folded them atop her bench. 20 years ago, my brother wrote to our family about a man who risked everything to save him and others during a firefight outside of Ramadi. That man was Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter. I have been trying to find him ever since. Across the room, Daniel blinked slowly. The judge's words wrapped around him like a fog. It took a moment before her meaning landed. He stared at her, really seeing her now. Her face had changed with time, older, sharper, and lined with experience, but something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place, struck a familiar chord. And then, in a heartbeat, it clicked. "Ryan," he whispered. Emma gave a single nod. "Yes. He spoke of you often." The room fell into a reverent hush. Nobody moved. Then Colonel Jenkins stepped forward. "Gunnery Sergeant Carter," he said with a proud nod, "it's been a long time. I was Ryan's commanding officer. I'm also here on behalf of the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative." He motioned to the corporal beside him, who opened a polished wooden box with ceremonial care. Inside, a glint of dark blue ribbon and gleaming silver caught the light, the Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Daniel's knees almost buckled. Colonel Jenkins spoke again, voice resonant with formality and respect. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy and in recognition of extraordinary heroism in combat, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Gunnery Sergeant Daniel T. Carter for gallantry and intrepidity in action on April 19, 2007, during Operation Vigilant Shield." A rustle moved through the courtroom like a wave. Even those unfamiliar with military honors instinctively understood this was no ordinary recognition. This was sacred. Daniel took a step back. There must be a mistake," he said, voice hoarse. "I was just doing my job." "There's no mistake," the colonel said. "You saved lives that day, and you changed others forever, including the lieutenants." From the gallery, a silver-haired man in civilian clothes stood up. His Marine League pin glinted on his lapel. "I was there," he called out. "Carter pulled me from under a burning Humvee. He's the reason I'm standing here today." Daniel looked around, stunned. The walls of silence he'd lived behind for years had cracked wide open. One by one, people began to rise from their seats, veterans, court employees, bystanders. Even the young prosecutor, once so clinical in his approach, stood now with quiet reverence. Judge Caldwell rose last. In light of this new information, and in recognition of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this case, she declared, "All charges against Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Carter are hereby dismissed with prejudice." She struck her gavel once, the sound echoing like a bell tolling for the end of a long war. "This court stands adjourned." But the story didn't end with a dismissed case and a medal in a box. As the gallery emptied, Daniel stood awkwardly, still stunned, unsure what to do next. His hands twitched, half expecting to be led away again. Instead, the master sergeant approached with a tablet in hand. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we've been trying to locate you. Your VA benefits have been fully reinstated, 100% service-connected disability, retroactive to your discharge date." Daniel blinked. What does that mean?" "It means a roof over your head. It means full medical coverage. It means substantial back pay. And it means you're not alone anymore." Benjamin Hull stepped beside him. "And my firm will see that every dime is in your hands. No more delays. No more red tape." Daniel swallowed hard. For years, he'd lived with nothing, eating donated food, sleeping under bridges, and dodging citations like bullets. Now, for the first time in decades, someone had remembered his name. From the back of the room, Tyler, the young cook from the cafe, approached with tears in his eyes. "My dad served in the Gulf," he said quietly. "He always told me a story about a Marine who saved his unit when everything went to hell. Said if I ever met a man named Carter, I owed him everything." He extended his hand. "I never knew it was you." Daniel reached out slowly and gripped his hand tight. "Neither did I," he murmured. Later that evening, Daniel found himself sitting in a warm office at the local Veterans Resource Center. A cup of real coffee in hand. Paperwork being completed. Plans for housing being made. It was overwhelming, but in the best way. In one corner of the office, a black and white photo hung on the wall. It showed a younger version of Colonel Jenkins and Lieutenant Caldwell, grinning beside a tank, faces covered in dust and joy. Daniel smiled softly. His throat tightened. "I thought I was forgotten," he said. Emma, now changed into civilian clothes, stepped into the room and sat beside him. "You were never forgotten," she said. "You were just waiting to be remembered by the right people." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, worn and folded, the ink faded. "This was the last letter my brother wrote," she said. "He talks about you in it. I think he wanted us to find you." Daniel took the letter with shaking hands. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the careful, neat handwriting. "Carter is the kind of Marine I hope I become someday," it read. "If I can be half as brave, half as loyal, then I'll be worthy of the uniform." Daniel closed his eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, he let himself cry. Daniel Carter stood in the hallway of the courthouse, holding the letter like it was a lifeline, one that tethered him to a version of himself he thought had long disappeared. For years, he'd carried memories like bricks in a rucksack, too heavy to speak of, too sacred to unload. But now, here in this strange collision of past and present, a door had opened that he never expected. He still wore the military coat that had sheltered him through countless freezing nights, but now it felt different on his shoulders. Not like a burden, but like armor again. Like something that mattered. Judge Caldwell, Emma, as she had asked him to call her, stood beside him quietly. "I thought saving him meant something back then," Daniel said, his voice low. "But after the news came, I started wondering if I just delayed the inevitable." Emma turned to him. "You didn't delay anything, Daniel. You gave us 2 more weeks with him. 2 weeks of letters, of hope, of believing we'd see him again. You gave our family something we can never repay." He looked at her for a long moment. Then nodded. He was a good officer. Not just on paper. He listened. That meant a lot more than orders ever did. A faint smile curved her lips. "He used to say the same about you." Later that afternoon, Daniel was escorted, not by police, but by Benjamin Hall and a VA case officer, to a small apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't luxurious. A simple 1-bedroom, with bare walls and old wood floors. But to Daniel, it might as well have been a palace. For the first time in years, he had keys to a place with a lock he controlled. On the wall above the kitchen counter, the Navy Cross had already been mounted in a pristine display frame, flanked by his original Purple Hearts, a Good Conduct Medal, and a row of campaign ribbons Benjamin had tracked down from a storage unit sale. They'd been lost years ago when Daniel's possessions were auctioned off after an eviction. The sight of those medals, symbols of a life he had lived with honor, nearly took his breath away. Benjamin clapped him on the back. "I figured it's about time they were back where they belong." Daniel's voice was a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ben replied. "Just, live. Rest. Heal. The world's got enough noise in it already." That evening, Emma visited again, this time without a robe or court documents. She wore jeans and a soft blue sweater, carrying a small cardboard box in her arms. "I brought something," she said from the doorway. Inside were dozens of letters. Some yellowed with age. Others crisp and white. All addressed to Mom and Dad or Emma in the same tidy handwriting. "These are from Ryan," she said as she placed the box on the table. "Every letter he wrote while deployed. I thought, maybe you'd want to read them." Daniel sat in silence for a moment, then opened one near the top. The familiar slant of Ryan's writing struck him like a punch to the chest. "I caught Carter humming Johnny Cash today while cleaning his rifle. Said it keeps the dust demons away. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, everyone listens. He's not just respected, he's followed. There's a difference." And I want to be that kind of man someday. Daniel smiled, eyes wet. You know, he said, he used to get this wrinkle right between his eyebrows when he was nervous. Like the world was just too much for him to hold. But he held it anyway. Emma laughed softly, brushing a tear away. I know the one. Then, for the first time, they talked, really talked. About Ryan. About war. About what it means to come home and feel like you're still on the battlefield. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's world continued to shift. The VA assigned him a dedicated case manager named Rachel Kim, a former Air Force medic who had transitioned into advocacy work. She was sharp, unrelenting, and had a way of balancing compassion with no-nonsense resolve. I'm not here to make you feel good, she told Daniel at their first meeting. I'm here to make sure no one ever forgets you again. Daniel respected her instantly. She helped him file for every benefit he'd once abandoned, connected him with a support group for veterans with PTSD, and personally scheduled his first therapy appointment in over 15 years. I'm not broken, he told her once, not out of defensiveness, but from a place of weary pride. She smiled. No. You're healing. And there's a difference. But the healing wasn't just for Daniel. Emma, too, found herself changed by it all. Inspired by Daniel's story, and her brother's legacy, she launched an initiative through the Veterans Court to create a remembrance registry, a searchable archive dedicated to tracking and reconnecting with veterans who had fallen through the cracks. It was part policy, part passion project, and it started with Daniel's name at the top of the list. At the launch ceremony, she said, we tell ourselves that no one is left behind. But too often, that's a promise only made on paper. This program is about making it real. Daniel attended, reluctantly. He didn't like the spotlight. But he stood tall, his back straight, his suit borrowed but crisp. And when his name was spoken, a standing ovation rose around him, not because he was a symbol, but because he was a survivor who had earned every ounce of respect. One night, as snow dusted the city like powdered sugar and the world seemed a little quieter, Daniel sat by the window of his apartment, sipping hot tea. The hum of the radiator, the soft light from a nearby lamp, it all felt like another life. On his coffee table sat a stack of Ryan's letters. He'd read them all. Some twice. A few he still wasn't ready for. And beneath them was one of his own, unfinished. He picked up the pen and began writing again. The snow continued to fall that night, blanketing the city like a quiet promise of peace. Inside his small but warm apartment, Daniel Carter held the pen steady in his calloused fingers, the words flowing slowly but steadily onto the page. He wasn't writing to anyone in particular, not officially. Maybe to himself. Maybe to Ryan. Maybe to every soul he'd left behind in the dust and fire of distant wars. I thought the war ended when I came home. I was wrong. It followed me, into the cracks of my mind, into the silence of every sleepless night, into the cold corners of every city where no one said my name anymore. He paused, staring at the last line, then carefully folded the letter and tucked it into a box beside the others. Not a journal. Not a collection. Just pieces of memory. Echoes of a man he'd worked hard to forget and now, unexpectedly, had been asked to remember. The following morning, Judge Emma Caldwell returned. She arrived without the formality of the court or the solemnity of ceremony, just Emma now, in a gray wool coat, with a brown paper bag in hand. I brought breakfast, she said with a small smile. Bagels from Stan's. Still warm. Daniel chuckled and opened the door wider. You always bring bagels. Trying to turn me into a New Yorker. I'm trying to turn you into someone who eats more than canned soup. They sat at the small kitchen table, two people forever linked by a moment neither of them had witnessed firsthand, but which had shaped both their lives. Emma pulled out another envelope, different from the others, and handed it to him. This was Ryan's final letter. The one that arrived a week after we buried him. It got held up in the system. Daniel stared at the envelope like it was glowing. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. I volunteered for patrol again. Don't be mad. There's a cell outside the city, insurgents targeting civilians. I couldn't sit back. Not after what Carter did. If he can run through fire for us, I can do something that matters too. The rest of the letter blurred behind tears. Emma's voice was quiet. He made that choice because of you, Daniel. You gave him something to believe in. Daniel set the letter down gently, then looked out the window. You know the hardest part? He said after a long pause. It wasn't losing men in combat. It was surviving. Watching the world keep turning while I got stuck. People forgot. Moved on. I became a ghost. Emma reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. Not anymore. The days continued, and for the first time in decades, Daniel began building a life, however slowly. He started attending a weekly PTSD support group at the local VA, led by Rachel Kim, who balanced clinical knowledge with battle-tested wisdom. The group included veterans from every conflict since Vietnam, each carrying their own invisible war. There was Luis, a former Army Ranger who hadn't spoken to his family in 12 years. Clint, a Navy corpsman who couldn't walk past a hospital without flashbacks. And Jessie, an Afghanistan vet who still wore her dog tags like armor. Together, they shared silence, then stories, then laughter. Real laughter. It was in one of these sessions that Daniel finally opened up about that day near Ramadi. We didn't think we were gonna make it, he said. Convoy got ambushed, dust everywhere. I saw Ryan go down trying to reach a wounded corpsman. The others were pinned. I don't know what came over me. I just ran. What were you thinking? Rachel asked gently. Daniel's eyes clouded. I wasn't. That's the thing. You don't think in moments like that. You act. Because that's what being a Marine means. No one gets left behind. Not on my watch. That phrase, not on my watch, spread quietly through the group and beyond. Rachel printed it on small wristbands that the center gave to veterans who had graduated from housing assistance programs. Emma printed it on the brochures for her remembrance registry. And Tyler, the cafe cook, painted it in bold letters on the alley wall where Daniel used to sit for warmth. A few weeks later, the city held its annual Veterans Honor Day, normally a modest event held in the town square. This year, though, it had grown. Word had spread about Daniel's story, local newspapers, then veterans' blogs, then even a national segment on public radio. Not as a spectacle, but as a symbol. Of resilience. Of recognition. Of how one forgotten name could remind the world of its promises. Daniel stood off to the side of the stage as Judge Caldwell took the podium. Her voice carried through the crowd, steady, proud. Today, we honor not just the medals and the uniforms, but the lives lived afterward. We honor the ones who came home and still fought battles no one could see. And we remember that heroes don't ask for parades. Most of them ask for nothing. That's why it's our job to give them everything. Then she called him to the stage. Daniel Carter walked slowly, hands shaking, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. As he reached the podium, the crowd rose in unison. Every single person. Veterans in faded hats, children waving flags, strangers holding back tears. Some saluted. Some simply stood. He didn't give a speech. He just leaned in toward the mic and said, "Someone remembered my name." That evening, Daniel returned to his apartment and opened the last box of letters. He found one addressed only with a nickname, Dust Dog. He smiled. It was a private joke between him and Ryan, a nickname earned after their unit rolled through a dust storm so thick they had to feel their way forward. Inside was just one line. You didn't leave me behind. I won't leave you either. Daniel folded it carefully, tucked it into his pocket, and stood at the window. The snow was falling again, and for once, he didn't mind the cold. Weeks passed. Then months. Spring thawed the snow that had blanketed Millstone, and the cold that had lived inside Daniel Carter for so long began to melt with it. He still had hard days. The kind where the silence of the apartment echoed too loud. The kind where sleep came reluctantly and memories barged in like uninvited guests. But now, there were people, real people, who checked in. Rachel from the VA texted once a week. Tyler dropped off groceries. Emma visited every Sunday with bagels and a new letter from Ryan to share. The apartment itself was modest, but it had started to feel like home. A second-hand couch. A bookshelf with his medals framed above it. A photo of his old unit beside one of the support group he now led on Wednesday nights. What once was a sterile space had become a living tribute, not just to his past, but to the life that had bloomed in its wake. On one wall hung a simple phrase, etched into wood by a local artisan who had heard Daniel's story on the radio. No one gets left behind. One day, as Daniel stood before the mirror adjusting the collar of a collared shirt, something he hadn't owned in years, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found Emma standing there in civilian clothes, holding a photo album and a soft smile. "Thought maybe you'd want to see something," she said. They sat at the kitchen table, turning the pages together. Inside were pictures of Ryan as a child, Ryan graduating from officer school, Ryan laughing at a family barbecue. Daniel paused at one of him and Ryan in uniform, taken just days before the attack in Ramadi. "That was the last photo before the letter," Emma whispered. Daniel touched the image lightly. He had this way of making you believe things would be okay, even when everything around you was on fire. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Emma reached for her bag again. "I have one last thing," she said, and pulled out a folder. Inside was a certificate from the VA confirming Daniel's full housing benefit, comprehensive medical care, and lifetime pension under corrected disability status. But more than that, it included an offer. "You've been asked to speak," she said, "at the National Veterans Honor Summit in D.C. Daniel blinked. "Why me?" Emma smiled. "Because stories like yours help fix a system that forgot how to listen." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not even sure I'm a symbol of anything." "You're a Marine," she said softly. "And that's enough." The next morning, Daniel Carter stood in front of a mirror, dressed in a crisp suit. On his chest, the Navy Cross rested over his heart. And for the first time in over 20 years, he walked into the world not as someone searching for warmth behind a dumpster, but as someone whose life had come full circle. Someone who had not been left behind. Legacies aren't about medals. They're about who picks up the torch next. It was late May in Washington, D.C., warm, breezy, and alive with possibility. The National Veterans Honor Summit drew thousands of attendees, veterans, service members, caregivers, students, and government officials. But this year, one name filled more seats than any other, Daniel Carter. Not because he was famous. But because he was real. Because in a world full of statistics, he was a story that lived and breathed, and reminded others what mattered. Daniel took the stage at the closing session, the bright lights making him squint. He hadn't written a speech. He'd tried. But every draft felt hollow. So he folded up a small photo of Ryan and kept it in his breast pocket. That was all he needed. "I've lived a life most people wouldn't believe," he began. "I've been a Marine. I've been a husband. I've been a man walking the streets with holes in his shoes and memories too heavy to carry." He paused, voice steady. "But through it all, I held on to one thing, one line we were taught from the beginning. No one gets left behind. Not when it's easy. Not when it's popular. Not even when the world forgets your name." He glanced at the crowd, locking eyes with strangers who suddenly didn't feel so strange. "This isn't just my story. It's ours. And if you're still here, still standing, you've got more to give." After the summit, the VA invited Daniel to help advise on a pilot initiative called Project Homeward, a multi-state effort to track, support, and restore dignity to forgotten veterans. Daniel agreed on one condition, that it not just be about forms and benefits, but about stories. Stories are what make people care, he said. A medal gets respect. But a letter gets remembered. He worked alongside Jesse, from his support group, and Luis, now sober and leading outreach programs of his own. Together, they traveled from city to city, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, visiting shelters, listening to vets, and helping reconnect the disconnected. In Denver, Daniel sat with a Vietnam veteran named Howard, who had been homeless for 34 years. "No one knows I'm alive," Howard said. Daniel handed him a VA phone and whispered, "Then let's remind them." A year later, Judge Emma Caldwell retired from the bench. At her farewell ceremony, she invited just one guest speaker, Daniel Carter. He took the podium quietly, holding the photo of Ryan once again. "She didn't just give me a second chance," he said. "She gave me my life back. And now, because of her, because of people like her, I get to give that chance to someone else." On the first day of fall, Daniel visited the newly opened Caldwell Veterans Resource Center, named in memory of both Ryan and Judge Caldwell. The building was modest, warm, and already full of people and possibilities. At the entrance, etched into the stone, were the words Daniel had spoken once in a silent courtroom. "Someone remembered my name."